All right, today we're going to cover the top 7 SaaS metrics that I think are the most important and the ones that you should have a really strong understanding of if you're going to invest in SaaS companies or if you're going to start a SaaS business, or maybe you already started one and you want to know what are the metrics that VCs care about most. All right, so the first one is probably the most important and probably the one you hear the most, and that is ARR, or annual recurring revenue. Now, the idea behind annual recurring revenue, the reason it's so important is because it's the thing that makes SaaS the most interesting to invest in. It is the revenue that contractually customers are going to pay you year after year after year as long as they remain customers within your business. And that gives you a ton of visibility into the future revenues of your business. It also gives you insight into how much you can spend and budget based on those customers. Maybe you're trying to decide how much money you should spend on marketing, or when you'll be able to go profitable, or how many more people you can hire. All of that is going to be based on the revenue that you're forecasting into the future. And the more predictability you have into forecasting that revenue means that you can theoretically do a much better job forecasting those expenses and future growth and so on and so forth. And that gives you a huge advantage over your traditional businesses that don't have a recurring revenue part of the business. The other advantage is that if you have recurring revenue, you're not trying to go out and capture that revenue every single year, because you captured it once and it going to keep coming in year after year after year, which also gives you a level of predictability that's incredibly helpful. Whenever I'm meeting with an entrepreneur in the SaaS space, that is the number one question that I'll have on my mind is, what is your ARR? It gives me a really good feel for where the company is at, how fast they've been growing, right? Especially if I know how old or how long they've been around in business. It usually gives me an idea of product market fit, or at least like directionally, like, hey, customers really like this product because there are a bunch of them that are spending money here. And it also gives me some idea of, where the company is going and where the potential is. So ARR, number one, most important metric. That's probably no surprise because it is the one that everybody talks about. The next one is one you probably hear a lot about, and that is your churn rate. Now, churn is incredibly important because I can have really high ARR, but if I'm losing customers, a ton of customers every month, then is it really like recurring, right? Like if I come to you and I say, oh yeah, I've got $1 million of ARR, but I have 100% churn rate, then that means the next year I got to go, if I want to grow to 2 million in ARR, 2 million in revenue, I've got to go find another, $2 million worth of customers, because I'm starting from zero if all my customers churn. And so churn rate is incredibly important. At its most basic, your churn rate is the rate at which customers are leaving the product or service that you are offering, right? They're canceling their contracts, they're not renewing, whatever it might be. But churn can be further broken down into logo or customer churn and revenue churn. And it's important to understand which one a company is referencing when they talk about their churn rate. Now, a logo or customer churn is, if I have 100 customers and I have 5% churn, well, then that means that on an annual basis, right, especially if I'm calculating churn on an annual basis, that 5 of those 100 customers are going to leave. On the other hand, revenue churn refers to the amount of revenue that's lost. And so if I have, 100 customers and each of those customers is paying me $10, well, then I'm generating $1,000 in recurring revenue. Well, if I have 5% churn rate, then that means that I'm going to lose like $50 of revenue. There are certain scenarios, especially in enterprise software, where you can have 2 different churn numbers that are wildly different. So you might have logo churn of like 5%. So every year I lose 5% of my customers, but the runs that remain, the other 95 customers, they spend more than they did the year before, because maybe they grow the size of their contract, they add more seats, more users to the platform. Maybe they add on a new product that you offer and you charge more for. So it can be the case where you lost 5 customers, but your revenue per customer actually went up, and so your churn actually flips and becomes negative, right? In other words, you have what's called negative churn, or where the amount of revenue that you lost from the customers that left your platform is more than offset by the customers that stayed and increased their contract size. Now, understanding both is really important because if you're not careful, you could say, oh yeah, we have negative churn, of like negative 10%. Or in other words, the customers that stuck around with us, the amount they spent with us increased, by enough that it's 10% more than the aggregate of what we lost. So maybe, the customers that left decreased revenue by 5%, but the customers that stayed increased revenue by 15%. And on a net basis, you have an increase of 10%. And you might think, oh, well, this is awesome. Like the business basically has no churn and we should spend every single dollar we have to acquire more customers. But it might also be the case that like their logo churn is really high. And over time, what'll happen is you will be fighting and you'll be spending more and more money to acquire more customers. And even though it looks like on a net basis, things are going really well, your customer acquisition costs will go through the roof. So what are customer acquisition costs? Let's go talk about that. So customer acquisition cost, or CAC, simply put, is the total cost of acquiring a new customer, including the marketing and sales expenses. And this metric is incredibly important because it helps SaaS businesses determine the effectiveness of their marketing and sales efforts and can be used to maximize and optimize these efforts to generate a really good return on investment. Now, a lot of companies that I've met with over the years, like they'll try to hide different things or take them out of their CAC, or they'll justify, different CAC numbers. From my experience, every single dollar that's related to acquiring that customer should be included in CAC. So sometimes you'll have them say, oh, well, we just look at like sales reps. These sales reps, we paid them this much and they generated this much in new revenue. So, that's our CAC is what we paid them. But they're not taking into consideration like their marketing expenses and some other, related expenses that really should be tied into CAC. So make sure that when you're evaluating what your CAC is, both as an entrepreneur or an investor, that you really dig in and try to understand what that total number is. Basically, all efforts that go into acquiring total customers should go into your average CAC, including and especially those that weren't successful and fruitful. I mean, ultimately, that's the area where I find entrepreneurs try to hide things the most, is they say, oh, well, we spent some stuff on this test and it just wasn't successful. So we're not including that money we spent into our CAC because it didn't generate any customers. But the reality is it should be included because you're probably, as a company, trying lots of different things, right? And some are going to be successful and some aren't. And you're going to have to constantly be iterating and testing things as you try to find new pools of customers to go after. And if you're not including it, then, there's this expense, this investment that you're not fully capturing that you're going to have to continue to pay into the future. Another aspect of CAC is payback period, and we're going to cover that in more detail later on in the video, so stay tuned. All right, the next really important metric is lifetime value of a customer, often known as LTV. LTV is the estimated total value of a customer over the entire period of their relationship with the company. This metric is important because it can help SaaS companies determine the optimal level of investment in customer acquisition and retention, and can be used to identify the most valuable customer segments. The basic equation here for LTV is dividing the average revenue per customer by the logo churn rate. So for example, if my average customer is paying me $100 per year, and I'm churning about 5% of those customers every year, then my lifetime value would be about $2,000, right? 100 divided by 5%. Now, LTV is an incredibly important number for a lot of reasons, and not just for SaaS businesses. I remember when I was in college, I heard this, like LTV was just like coming out as this general concept for all businesses. And the argument was that, a lot of people are like, well, I can only spend so much on marketing to acquire this customer because I still have to cover like cost of goods sold and I have to cover operating overhead and, then I still want to generate a profit. So, let's say, for example, I sell a widget for $100. And my cost to produce that widget's $25, that leaves me $75. Well, and then I've got overhead of that, so maybe that's another $25, so that leaves me with $50. Well, a lot of people are like, well, if you want to have 25% profit margins, then you can only spend $25 on marketing. And the idea here was, if you really understand though that customer might come back in a year from now, right? Then you could spend more on marketing, because the next time they come back, you're not spending to acquire that customer again, right? That's all gravy. And so that what that does is that pushes you to provide a very high quality product, a really great experience, but also one that isn't like a one-time purchase, so that customers love the product and they come back to keep buying that same product or other products from you. You can look at the lifetime value of the customer, and then that would allow you to spend more on marketing that first go. In fact, you might lose money on the customer the very first time they buy from you, as long as you have a high degree of confidence that they'll come back again and again and again. We had a company, we're an investor in a company called Urban Stems, and Urban Stems sells flowers, right? So LTV, super important, particularly for SaaS businesses, because they're looking at this recurring revenue that comes in every year. And so you want to make sure you understand how long that revenue is going to come in from that customer, because again, it gives you insight into how much you can spend on marketing and how to budget and plan for other parts of your business. All right, the next one is simply the combination of LTV and CAC through the LTV-CAC ratio. This ratio represents how much revenue a customer brings in versus how much it costs you to acquire them. An LTV-CAC ratio of 3x would therefore mean that you make $3 for every dollar you spent to acquire that customer. Technically, every customer has their own individual CAC, and knowing that number can help you determine who your ideal customers really are. Generally, you want to be around a 3x. Lower, and your product might either have too high of churn, might not be priced appropriately, you might be spending too much on CAC to acquire them. There could be a lot of issues. Generally though, sub 3 makes me think that either you are overspending or that you don't have true product market fit. The flip side though is sometimes we'll have entrepreneurs come in and they'll be like, we have an LTV to CAC ratio of like 30x. And those should also cause you pause, because one, they're probably not calculating it correctly. It's very rare to have CAC to LTV ratios that are that high. And the other issue, and this is probably a more important one, is that if you have really high LTV to CAC, what might actually be happening is you are underspending on marketing. So let's say you have two companies, one has an LTV to CAC ratio of 10 and the other one has an LTV CAC ratio of 3. Well, it could be that other company looks worse on the metric because they're like, oh, well, 10 is definitely better than 3. But it may be that the other company is spending a lot more money because they see this as a land grab. I need to get all the customers onboarded with me. Once they're on with me, they're less likely to switch to this competitor. And so I'm trying to gather up as many customers as I can, because over time, I'm going to make $3 per dollar. And so I should be spending all day long to acquire as many of those $3 customers as I possibly can. Whereas the other company that's generating a much higher LTV to CAC ratio might be underspending and might be being left behind and ultimately put out of business by this faster, higher spend competitor. Which is part of the reason why a lot of companies have been spending a ton of money in SaaS over the last few years. If this is helpful, or you have more questions on how this all works, throw them down in the comments below so I know what additional videos I should make to cover some of these things. The next one I want to cover really quick is revenue mix. Now, sometimes you'll meet with companies and they'll be like, oh yeah, we're a SaaS business and ARR was $10 million last year. But then when you peel it back, what you realize is they've conflated revenue with recurring revenue, right? And ARR really is just the revenue that is subscription revenue that's going to be renewed every year, right? Because oftentimes companies will have a lot of revenue that comes in for providing different services. So for example, you might have training and onboarding and support and all of these other products that are sold, and so they're generating revenue, but they aren't really recurring, right? If I'm going to onboard a customer, I'm going to train all of their staff, that's kind of like a one-time expense. And on top of that, it probably doesn't have super high margins because I'm going to have people that go out and do the training, et cetera, and I'm going to have to pay those people. And so generally those revenue items have much lower margins than SaaS, where, SaaS, your cost of goods sold for a SaaS business usually is just the cost of the server space. If you're using AWS or Azure or whatever it might be, that's really your only cost of goods sold. And so you can have varying levels of gross margin depending on the product that's being sold. And so it's important to really understand how much of their revenue is going to be subscription revenue and recurring true ARR, and how much of it is kind of more one-time servicey type revenue. Now, a couple of things I want to say about this. One is you're going to get valued very differently based on your type of revenue. So if your business is mostly ARR in your revenue as a percentage, then you're going to have a much higher valuation because that revenue gets, it's a higher margin, it's more predictable, it's just higher quality revenue, and so it's going to be valued a lot higher. It's the case where like your services revenue might be valued at like 1 or 2x. Your one-time like services revenue might only be valued at like 1 or 2x, and your recurring revenue might be valued at closer to like 10x, right? So those can vary. The other thing I want to say really quickly is that sometimes you meet with companies and they don't have very much of one-time services revenue. And that should actually be a red flag to you, because if they're not spending to get their customers fully onboarded, trained, integrated, using the product, engaged, that might show up in higher churn rates a year or two from now. So especially when you're evaluating earlier stage companies, both types of revenue are important. Just make sure you really understand what that ratio looks like. All right, you stuck around to the end, so let me talk about payback periods, because payback periods are one of those like hidden metrics that not a lot of people talk about, but in my opinion, end up killing companies all the time. Because the number one killer of a business is that they run out of cash, right? You don't have cash, you run out of business. So this is where payback period becomes really important. In a SaaS business, the beauty of it is that you can spend a lot of money to acquire customers because you have visibility into the future revenue of what they're going to generate, right? I mean, think about my example before. Like, let's say you have a business that generates 10 times the lifetime value relative to the CAC, right? So for every dollar I spend to acquire a customer, they are going to generate $10 over their lifetime. That sounds phenomenal, right? And in that case, it sounds like I should be spending every dollar I can get my hands on, right? I should burn a ton of money acquiring those customers because they're going to generate $10 for every dollar I spent. But what if I told you their payback period was 100 years, right? Well, what that means then is that it could cost me a ton of money in year one to acquire that customer, and I'm not going to get paid back for a long time. Maybe my payback period on a business is like 5 years, right? Well, what that means is I basically have to finance the customer acquisition cost of that customer for 5 years. And that can be incredibly hard on a business from a cash flow perspective. Now, when money is cheap and easy, right? So like you think about 2020, 2021, interest rates, all-time lows, tons of money in the market, super easy for SaaS businesses to raise money. There were a lot of businesses that were saying, hey, I'm going to take a bunch of money, I'm going to raise a bunch of money from investors, and I'm going to invest it. And even though my payback periods are like 5 years, it's okay because I can just go back and raise more money. And all I have to do is flash around this really sexy 10x LTV to CAC ratio. Fast forward today, markets have contracted significantly, and all of a sudden these businesses are like, oh crap, I can't raise money as easily as I used to be able to, and it's really expensive to start financing 5 years before I get fully paid back on that investment I made with my CAC. And so what you're seeing is a ton of companies are either going out of business or they're raising at very low down rounds, they're cutting a ton of their staff, they're doing everything they can to survive those 5 years or whatever it might be until their customers turn profitable again, and really hampering growth. And all of a sudden you're seeing these businesses that were like growing super fast and super sexy and all these things and had great SaaS metrics that are all imploding. And the reason is in many cases because their payback period was just way too long and too expensive to finance. So pay attention to payback period. Generally, I like to see payback periods that are sub 3 years, and my all-time favorite is anything that's under a year, which means if I invest $1, I'm going to generate at least $1 of revenue within the first year of that customer being on board. And that then makes the whole flywheel just that much easier and that much faster to getting to true profitability. All right, if this video is helpful, check out some of my other videos, like how to start a private equity fund with no money. Thanks.